Welcome, students. Today we'll be talking about Satyajit Ray's realism and his famous trilogy consisting of Pather Pachali, released in 1955, Aparajita, released in 1956, and Upur Sangsar, released in 1959. These three films clubbed together, which is named as Opu trilogy, named after the protagonist Opu of these three films. It was an adaptation of Bibhuti Bhushan Bandyopadhyay's two novels, Pather Pachali and Aparajita. So the first novel, Pather Pachali, it adapts the first initial section of the novel, and the second film, Aparajito, it takes over just from where the earlier film left over and went into and goes straight into the second novel. And Opu Sangsar, it adapts a section of the second novel. Now, these three films, they become instant classics, and they are remembered as a triumph of the realist form of cinema, a kind of realist form which was in vogue in the art cinema movements just after the war, and mainly spearheaded by Italian neorealism. Now, Italian neorealism is definitely a formative influence on these three films, but one should not confuse these three films as an exact depiction of Italian neorealism, because apart from Italian neorealism, one of the major influence in these three films was the literary realism which was practiced in Bengal, and Bibhuti Bhushan Bandyopadhyay was one of the most famous practitioners of a certain kind of literary realism in Bengali literature. Now, if we talk about Pather Pachali, the first film which started filming in 1952 and was released in 1955, then you will see that Satyajit Ray is not exactly depicting the entire novel as it is in the film. He's selecting a lot, keeping certain things, enhancing few things, and underlining few things. Now, if you look carefully at the first three sequences of the film, in the first sequence, we'll see that the film is depicting how a little girl, that is Durga, how she actually goes about in a rural village during the afternoon. So the film is not starting with any kind of story. It just depicts a situation. In the second sequence, we'll see that how middle-aged women or housewives in their prime, housewives in their 30s or so, how they go about in a typical afternoon rural setup, how they go about with the work, the rhythm of their work, and so on and so forth. And in the third sequence, we'll see that how a very old woman, one of the principal characters in the film, Indira Thakurun, how she moves around in a slow gait, in her way, in a village home, in a typical rural Bengal setting. In this way, these three initial sequences, it does not exactly present us a story, but presents us certain situation, and these situations are depicted in correspondence, in close correspondence of reality as it is in a typical rural Bengal setup. And therefore, we'll see that the film stresses on real locations, on real light conditions, and often on non-professional actors, in the sense that actors, just like Little Durga, the actors who are already like that of the characters. And we will see in a very intelligent adaptation of the story, where the novel is primarily a kind of Bildungsroman, that is the coming of age story of the principal protagonist, and a Bildungsroman which often centers on the male character. The film actually depicts the initial phases through the experiences of the woman of the village. So, in that sense, a domestic, feminine world is actually constructed through the first three sequences. And interestingly, the first three sequences, it almost lays bare almost all of the themes of the stories. That is, the a small family in privation, struggling with poverty, and this lack of amenities, and gradually declining resources in a family which is still trying to survive hard. All these aspects, along with the positive aspects of the life, that that of the small pleasures, that of the pleasures of food, so on and so forth, they are all depicted in these three sequences without necessarily starting the story. Now, if we talk about a major sequence of the film, that is the train sequence, then we'll understand how Satyajit interestingly adapts the novel into the film. In the train sequence, we see that Oppu and Durga, they are suddenly encountering the train. As such, in a typical rural field of Bengal, this train is something new to them, and we see that Durga and Oppu rushes towards the train. Durga falls down, and Oppu suddenly encounters the train, which appears like an alien monster hurtling in the field. In the novel, this this scene was actually much later. The scene was much later after the death of Durga. But Satyajit Ray keeps Durga a principal character in the scene. And in the meantime, if you recall the way the scene is presented, we'll understand that the scene is intercut between other scenes. In the meantime, Indra Thakurun is dying in a bamboo grove nearby. In the novel, the scene of Indra Thakurun's death was much earlier. Now, Satyajit Ray is actually clubbing two major scenes together in the film: the death of Indra Thakurun and Oppu and Durga viewing the train. So in this way, Satyajit is adapting one single line of the novel, a single line which says that with the passing away, with the death of Indra Thakurun, the yesteryears of Nishchindipur, that is the village where the entire event takes place, the yesteryears of Nishchindipur, they came to an end. And therefore, Satyajit Ray, in a way, creates a meaning, that is Indra Thakurun's death and the coming of the train, which symbolizes modernity, they happen together. In a way, the ancient days, they go away and the modernity comes in. This is how one can say, this is how the novel intelligently, with a certain economy of meaning, depicts or adapts the novel in a kind of way. Now, if we come to the second film, Aparajito, which was released in 1956. If we look back at Pather Pachali, we'll see that Pather Pachali ends exactly at the point when the family leaves the village that is Nishchindipur. Now, Satyajit thought that though the main novel continues after this point, the film should end there. And in this way, a certain kind of unity of space is created. That is, the entire film, Pather Pachali, it is relegated to a singular space. Now, this is not the structure in Aparajito. In Aparajito, instead, we see that space is slowly gathering a kind of meaning, because the earlier half of the film, it is set in Benares, where Oppu's father dies. The second half of the film is set in an almost nondescript rural Bengali village, and the third of the half of the film, which ends in the death of Sharbojaya, Oppu's mother, it is placed contextualized in Calcutta. Now, if you look at these spaces very carefully, we understand that this arrangement of space, it creates a certain kind of meaning, because Benares is one of the most ancient cities of the world. And Kolkata or Calcutta is one of the youngest city in the world, a city entirely born out of British colonialism. So, in this way, this journey from Benares to Calcutta and the in transit in the middle, the rural Bengal in middle, it creates a story of an allegory of Indian civilization as such. That is Indian civilization starting from the ancient days and ending up in the age of colonialism. Therefore, in Oporajito, Satyajit Ray starts evoking certain aspects of history which becomes very important. And the same thing continues in Opur Sangsar. So in Opur Sangsar we see that the entire story is located firmly within Calcutta with certain departures to rural Bengal. But in an interesting way, the Opu in Opur Sangsar is more urban rather than the Opu in Oporajito. In Oporajito, the Opu is actually a bumbling village boy who is not in ease in the Calcutta conditions. But in Opu Sangsar, we see that Opu has become a suave modern man. And in this way, Satyajit starts commenting on the novel in a certain kind of way, which is not there in the novel. That how Opu is slowly displaced from his roots, and how this displacement he is not aware of. And once Aparna, his wife who comes from the rural Bengal, once he dies, Opu is shocked to the belief, she is shocked to the perception that he has lost all his connection from the earlier life with the death of all major women in his life. That is, it starts with Indira Thakurun, then with Durga, his sister, then with Sharbojaya, his mother, and then his wife Aparna. And in this way, in the last half of Opur Sangsar, we see that the film is not rooted in any space. Once Aparna dies, we see Opu wandering all over India, and there is a major sequence where we see him in the forest, strolling in the forest, we see him by the seaside, and then we see him somewhere in certain mines near Bihar or a place like that, somewhere in middle India, and we see the film is located nowhere. And at the end of the film, it's almost like a work of reconciliation. How Opu, who is now rooted in no space, has to come into terms with his little boy, during whose birth his wife died, and Opu has to come into terms with the boy, create the little family that is left over in the absence of all women of the family, and Opu has to now come into terms with it, and only then he can be rooted in any space. And at the end of the trilogy, we see Opu and Kajol, they are most probably moving towards Kolkata, and Kolkata becomes the city where the future of this family is left.
তুমি আসবে আমার সঙ্গে
কাজল
চলে এসো
কাজলা
In this way, the entire film, starting from Pather Pachali to Oporajito to Opur Sangsar, creates a kind of poetry of spaces and a poetry of time. And this poetry is achieved through the real depiction of bodies in space. That is rural Bengal or Benares or Kolkata, so on and so forth. Therefore, the space becomes important characters in the film. Therefore, the realism of Opu trilogy is constructed through an intelligent use of real spaces, non-professional actors, real light conditions, so on and so forth. And in this way, one must remember not only Satyajit Ray's direction, his renewed imagination of cinematic realism, but one must also recall the contributions of the famous cinematographer Subrata Mitra, the art designer Bongshi Chandragupta, so on and so forth. And Subrata Mitra's cinematography actually does something which was novel in global standards during those days. If we recall the initial section of Aparajito, then we'll see that the initial section of Aparajito is depicted in Benares. And the film starts with certain non-fictional footages, non-fictional shots of Harihar Rai that is Apu's father, in the ghats of Benares. Then, in a kind of depiction where the entire film depicts the space of Benares in a non-fictional kind of way, in a generalized kind of way, we slowly come to the character. Then we see the character the characters moving up the steps of Benares. And in this way, the entire initial section of the film, it's actually in a precision, it concises a time from the early morning, from the wee hours of the morning, to somewhere around 6:30 or 7, so on and so forth. And we understand it through the shadows. Then we see that Harihar Rai is walking up the stairs and moving inside his house in Benares. This house is constructed in the sets, in the studios of Kolkata, and there is a seamless continuity in the light conditions of these two scenes. That is one scene which is shot in Benares and the next scene which is shot in Kolkata. And to achieve this, it is achieved through the brilliant art direction of Bongshi Chandragupta, but it is also done through the very clever use of light, a method which was devised by Subrata Mitra, which was called bounced lighting. That is, to depict the situation of Benares, what Subrata Mitra did, he understood that in Benares, where there are dingy lanes and heavy architectures and tall architectures as such, the sunlight never comes directly in any space. It gets reflected through walls and so on and so forth. So Subrata Mitra devised a method of lighting which is called bounce lighting, where where the lights are not directly placed or directly thrown on the characters, but they are bounced in a white cloth which is strung above. And this kind of lighting creates a diffused sense of light which is almostly equal to that of the real conditions of Benares. And in this way, in Aparajito, we see that there is a seamless continuity between the indoors and the outdoors. If you recall the editing which of course supervised by Satyajit Ray, and actually the editing is conducted by Dulal Datta, then we'll see that in Aparajito, the entire, and in these three films actually, the entire film form, it comes closer to a kind of psychological realism. Now, what did Satyajit Ray achieve? What Satyajit Ray achieved, and this will be a inspiration throughout the 60s and 70s to the filmmaking world, all over the world, to new cinemas all over the world. That is, he divorced technique from technology. Now we should understand this, that technique is something which might not be dependent on expensive technology. So what Satyajit Ray did, he understood that cinema is a medium of limitations and one has to make good within the limitations one is in. So he created a rich language of cinema with very meager means of filmmaking. And thus we see that Satyajit Ray is actually, along with Subrata Mitra, Bongshi Chandragupta, and others, Satyajit Ray is creating a world-class cinema which is created through little means as such. So to conclude, in today's lecture, we understood how Satyajit Ray's cinema, it created a new realistic idiom, not only within Bengali and Indian cinema, but in world cinema as well. It created an idiom which culled intelligently from the local literary realism and from aspects of realism all over the world. It took things from classical Hollywood cinema, it took things from Jean Renoir's poetic realism, and it also took things from Italian neorealism, created a new model of realism as such. A realism which can not only depicts things realistically but also create a meaning out of the clever use of space, out of clever use of time, and a realism which slowly, through the use of details, through the use of gestures, through the use of locations, it starts telling stories in a way which can also veer into a kind of psychological realism, where characters are depicted not through dramatic means many a time, not through melodramatic hyper dramatic actions or through words, but through little gestures and little ideas, so on and so forth. To conclude, we should understand Shotrita's realism as a realism which is distinct from classical Hollywood realism on one hand and also Italian neorealism on the other hand, because Italian neorealism was a realism of the contemporary. Shotrita's realism, on the other hand, was a realism which is not only dealing with contemporary but with modernity as such.